It might be supposed that philosophy of all subjects must be free from the vagaries of fashion, but that is not so. In philosophy, just as in other human activities, in each generation there seems to be a reaction against the values of the previous generation. So writers that have been widely studied fall into neglect, and new figures come to the fore. The outcome is apt to be that at any given time and place, many of the same philosophers are being studied by everyone, and a number of other well-known philosophers are being neglected by, at any rate, nearly everyone. Then a new generation comes along and re-evaluates one or two of the neglected philosophers so that they then come back into fashion, and so it goes on. Among the philosophers to whom this has happened most conspicuously in the last 200 years is Schopenhauer. For most of his lifetime, roughly the first half of the 19th century, he was almost totally disregarded. Then, in the second half of the 19th century, he became one of the most famous and influential of all philosophers. Then, in the first half of the 20th century, he fell into a neglect so profound that even most teachers of philosophy no longer read him. But now, in our own time, he is unmistakably coming back to people's attention, not least because he was a formative influence on one of the most important 20th century philosophers, Wittgenstein. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in Danzig, now Gdansk, in 1788. His family had been rich Hanseatic merchants for generations, and the upbringing he received was aimed not at an academic life, but at training him to step into an international business. However, he had no interest in the family firm. He insisted on going to university instead, and thereafter he used his private means to finance a lifetime of independent study and writing. His doctorate thesis has become a minor classic, in spite of its title, On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason. And he was still in his 20s during the 4 years when he composed his masterpiece, The World as Will and Representation, which was published in 1818, the year in which he was 30. From then until his death in 1860, at the age of 72, he published a great deal, but all of it was to extend or elaborate or enrich the philosophical system which he had constructed in his 20s and from which he never departed. He produced a huge collection of essays called Parerga and Paralipomena, and 2 short but pungent books on ethics called The Basis of Morality and The Freedom of the Will. There was also a little book called On the Will in Nature, designed to show that his ideas were supported by discoveries in science. Most important of all, he published a revised edition of The World as Will and Representation, which was more than twice the length of the original volume. There are several remarkable things about him. Although in direct succession to Kant's, his own work was securely in the mainstream of Western philosophy, he was genuinely knowledgeable about Hinduism and Buddhism, and is the only major Western philosopher to draw serious and interesting parallels between Western and Eastern thought. He was the first major Western philosopher to be openly and explicitly atheist. He placed the arts higher in the scheme of things and had more to say about them than any other important philosopher. And perhaps partly for that reason, his influence on creative artists of the front rank has exceeded that of any other philosopher of the modern era. He was himself among the supreme writers of German prose. Many of his sentences are so brilliantly aphoristic that they've been torn out of context by the 100 and published separately in little books of epigrams. Intellectually, this is a catastrophe, because it obscures the fact that Schopenhauer is first and foremost a system builder, whose philosophy can be understood only as a whole. Of the books in print about it in English at the time of making this program, I have to confess to you that the longest and most recent is by me, but I can't very well interview myself, so I've invited the author of one of the others to come along and discuss Schopenhauer with me. My guest is, in any case, the most distinguished living historian of philosophy in the English language, Frederick Copleston, Emeritus Professor in the University of London. In addition to his extended treatment of Schopenhauer in his 9-volume History of Philosophy, he's written a separate book about him called Arthur Schopenhauer, Philosopher of Pessimism. Well, Professor Copleston, I think the place we ought to start is by addressing ourselves to the question of what it was that Schopenhauer set out to do. Perhaps I should let you take that up.
Well, Mr. McGee, I think that, like other original philosophers, a great many of them, Schopenhauer wanted to understand the world in which he found himself, the world in which he lived, or one could say he tried to form a coherent, unified interpretation of human experience, or to gain conceptual mastery over the world of phenomena, the plurality of phenomena. I think that is it. And to do that, Schopenhauer thought that it was necessary to identify the underlying reality. If one asks why he thought that there was an underlying reality to identify, I suppose that the reason, one main reason, is that he started from the premises of Immanuel Kant, and that he thought that the way in which we see the world is a human perspective, that the human mind is pre-programmed to see the world in certain ways, and we can't, for example, experience objects except as situated in space and time, as subject to spatial temporal relations and as subject to the relation of causality. But it obviously doesn't follow that because things appear to one in a certain way, that is how they are apart from the way in which they appear, as they are in themselves. Kant certainly took it that the concept of a thing in itself is not as that which appears, but can be considered in distinction from the appearance, was a sensible idea, and Schopenhauer took that over.
I think this is such an important idea, and we're going to come back to it in different ways, that it's worth going over again, because it's difficult, I think, for people who are new to it to really get hold of it sometimes. Kant had argued that all possible experience can only come to us through our faculties, through our sensory and mental apparatus. And therefore, what we could experience depended not only on what there is out there to experience, but also on the nature of the faculties that we possess, what our faculties could handle, what they do to what they handle, how they handle it, and so on. So that all experience as such is subject-dependent. And he went on from that to argue that, therefore, we could see total reality as being divided into two. There are things as they are in themselves, independently of being experienced, and to such things we have no means of access. And then there's things as they appear to us, the world of appearances, the world as it comes to us through experience, and that's what we know. That's the world of common sense, the world of science, our total world. Now, Schopenhauer took this up from Kant and said, now, can we get any pointers, can we get any hints from a close analysis of this world of experience as to what it might be that underlies it, as to what it might be that lies behind it? That, at least, is part of the thought, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I think it's important to remember that for Schopenhauer there can be only one underlying reality. Kant himself took it as a matter of common sense, I think, that if there's the table as it appears, then there must be the table as it is in itself, and if the carpet as it appears, then there's the carpet in itself, that there are a multitude of things in themselves. But, of course, if we think away spatial and temporal relations and the causal relation, there's no means of distinguishing one thing from another. So that if the underlying reality transcends space and time and causality and is quite other than the world of phenomena, then number one, the plurality or multiplicity belongs to the world of phenomena, but the underlying reality must be one.